My name is Serafina Walsh, and I'm 32 years old. For 3 decades, I believed I was the family disappointment, the slow daughter who couldn't measure up to my brilliant sister. My parents made sure I knew exactly where I stood every single day. But last Tuesday, one yellowed envelope hidden in my grandmother's attic completely shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. What I discovered inside didn't just reveal the truth about my past, it exposed a web of lies so devastating that it destroyed my parents' perfect facade and gave me the sweetest revenge I never knew I needed. Before we dive into this story that literally changed my entire life, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? If you're ready for a family drama that'll make your jaw drop, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because this revenge story has more twists than a soap opera. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the truth finally comes out. Growing up in the Walsh household was like living in a carefully orchestrated performance where I was perpetually cast as the comic relief, except nobody was laughing. My sister Cordelia, just 2 years older, was the shining star, the golden child who could do absolutely no wrong in my parents' eyes. While she sailed through advanced placement classes and earned scholarships to prestigious universities, I struggled with what my parents constantly referred to as my learning difficulties. Serafina, honey, why can't you be more like your sister? Became the soundtrack of my childhood. My mother, Patricia Walsh, would say this with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all her disappointed maternal dreams. My father, Richard Walsh, a successful corporate lawyer, was even less subtle. He'd openly tell people at dinner parties that he had one brilliant daughter and one who tries very hard. The comparisons were relentless and devastating. When Cordelia graduated valedictorian, I barely managed to pass my senior year. When she got into Harvard Medical School with a full scholarship, I enrolled in community college for basic business courses. When she published research papers, I was celebrating landing a part-time job at a local bookstore. Every family gathering became an exhibition of Cordelia's achievements versus my apparent failures. The financial disparity was just as brutal. My parents funded Cordelia's education entirely, undergraduate medical school residency expenses, even her first apartment in Boston. They bought her a car for her 16th birthday, a new one for college, and helped her with the down payment on her first house. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs to pay for my community college classes and drove a 10-year-old used car that broke down more often than it ran. We invest where we see potential, my father would explain coldly whenever I asked why the treatment was so different. Cordelia will be able to provide returns on our investment. You, well, we love you, but we have to be realistic about expectations. My mother would soften it slightly. Every family has different children with different strengths, sweetheart. Cordelia's just more academically inclined. But the message was always crystal clear. I was the disappointment, the child who hadn't lived up to their intellectual standards. The emotional abuse was subtle, but constant. They never missed an opportunity to point out my mistakes or highlight how Cordelia would have handled something better. When I struggled with math, it wasn't a learning difference, it was laziness. When I chose art classes over advanced sciences, it wasn't following my passion, it was taking the easy way out. When I eventually dropped out of college to focus on work, it was exactly what they expected from someone with my limitations. Cordelia, to her credit, never actively participated in putting me down, but she also never stood up for me. She basked in the praise and attention, accepting our parents' favoritism as her natural due. She'd offer occasional sympathy, "Don't let them get to you, Sarah," but she never challenged the fundamental dynamic that kept her elevated and me diminished. The most painful part wasn't even the obvious favoritism, it was how they made me believe I deserved it. By the time I was in my 20s, I had internalized their assessment of my worth. I genuinely believed I was less intelligent, less capable, less deserving of investment or respect. I apologized constantly for taking up space, for needing help, for existing as anything other than a reflection of their parenting success. Last year, when Cordelia finished her medical residency, my parents threw her an elaborate celebration party and announced they were giving her a gift of $10 million to her inheritance early. They called it to help her establish her medical practice and buy her dream house. The announcement was made in front of 50 guests, including extended family, friends, and colleagues. Everyone applauded as they handed her an oversized check like she'd won the lottery. I sat in the corner of the room wearing a dress I'd bought at a thrift store, watching my parents beam with pride as they talked about their investment in their daughter's brilliant future. When someone asked about my future, my mother just smiled sadly and said, "We're hoping Serafina will find her path eventually." That night, I drove home to my small one-bedroom apartment and cried until I had no tears left. I wasn't even angry anymore, just hollow, accepting that this was simply how life worked in my family. Some children were born to shine, and others were born to remind everyone how bright the shining ones really were. 3 months after Cordelia's $10 million celebration, my grandmother, Eleanor, my father's mother, passed away quietly in her sleep. She was 93 and had lived in the same Victorian house for over 60 years. While my parents and Cordelia handled the important matters like the will reading and estate planning, I was relegated to what they considered appropriate for my skill level, cleaning out her attic and basement. "It's perfect for you, Serafina," my mother said with that familiar tone of making a burden sound like a favor. "You're so good with organizing things, and honestly, it's mostly just old junk that needs to be sorted for donation anyway." My grandmother had always been different from my parents. While they saw my struggles as failures, she saw them as challenges to overcome. She was the one person in the family who never made me feel stupid or worthless. When I was growing up, her house was my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without being compared to Cordelia every 5 minutes. "You have a good heart, Serafina," she used to tell me. "That's worth more than all the book smarts in the world." At the time, it felt like a consolation prize, a gentle way of saying I wasn't smart enough for real success. But she always said it with such conviction that part of me wanted to believe her. The attic was a treasure trove of family history, old photographs, vintage clothes, furniture covered in decades of dust, and boxes upon boxes of documents and keepsakes. I spent the better part of a week up there carefully sorting through items, deciding what might have value and what could be donated. My parents had made it clear they expected me to handle things efficiently and not bother them with decisions about worthless old stuff. Most of the documents were exactly what you'd expect: old insurance papers, outdated warranties, church bulletins, recipe cards written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. I found photo albums chronicling our family's history, letters from relatives, and even some of my childhood artwork that she'd apparently saved all these years. It was touching but also painfully nostalgic, reminding me of simpler times when I still thought I might grow up to be someone my parents could be proud of. It was on my 4th day in the attic that I found it. I was moving a heavy trunk that had been pushed far back under the eaves when I noticed a loose floorboard. When I stepped on it, it creaked and shifted in a way that didn't feel right. Curious, I used a screwdriver to pry it up, thinking maybe there was a structural issue I should mention to whoever would be handling the house sale. Underneath the loose board was a small metal box, the kind people use for important documents. It was wrapped in an old blanket and had clearly been hidden there intentionally. My heart started racing as I lifted it out. The box was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom, typical of my grandmother's practical approach to security. Inside the box were documents that initially seemed random: bank statements, legal papers, what looked like academic records. But as I started reading more carefully, my blood turned cold. These weren't random documents, they were records that told a story I'd never heard before, a story that turned my entire understanding of my family upside down. The first shock was a folder labeled Serafina, Educational Records. Inside were report cards and test scores that didn't match anything I remembered from my childhood. According to these documents, I hadn't struggled in school at all. In fact, I'd been recommended for gifted programs, had scored in the 95th percentile on standardized tests, and had teachers writing notes about my exceptional analytical abilities. But the real bombshell was a thick manila envelope marked Legal Confidential in my grandmother's handwriting. Inside were documents that made my hands shake as I read them, correspondence between my grandmother and various lawyers, records of private investigators, and copies of medical records that told an impossible story. According to these papers, I hadn't been born with learning difficulties. I had been systematically poisoned. The medical records hit me like a physical blow. Page after page of laboratory results, doctor's notes, and toxicology reports painted a picture so horrific I had to read it 3 times before my brain could process what I was seeing. From ages 6 to 16, I had been regularly drugged with a combination of mild sedatives and cognitive suppressants that had been slowly, methodically destroying my ability to think clearly. The drugs weren't enough to cause obvious physical symptoms. They were carefully calculated to mimic learning disabilities, attention disorders, and general intellectual sluggishness. But the cumulative effect over 10 years had been devastating to my developing brain, my academic performance, and my self-esteem. My grandmother's notes, written in her careful handwriting, revealed the whole horrible truth. She had become suspicious when she noticed how differently I behaved at her house versus at home. At my parents' house, I was lethargic, confused, and struggled to focus. At her house, I was bright, curious, and quick to learn. She had started documenting these differences, taking pictures, and even secretly recording conversations. The private investigator's report was damning. My parents had been crushing medication into my food and drinks for a decade. The drugs were prescription medications, anti-anxiety medications, and mild antipsychotics that my mother had been obtaining through various doctors, claiming she was treating her own stress and insomnia. The investigator had documented pharmacy records, prescription histories, and had even managed to get evidence of my mother crushing pills and mixing them into my breakfast juice. But the most devastating revelation was why they had done this to me. According to the investigator's findings, it all came down to money, specifically my great-aunt Millicent's inheritance. Great-aunt Millicent had been my grandmother's sister and had died when I was 5 years old. She had left her considerable fortune, approximately $15 million, to be divided equally between her great-nieces, but with one crucial stipulation: the money would only be released when both children reached age 30 and had demonstrated intellectual and moral character befitting the family legacy. The inheritance was managed by a trust that required both Cordelia and me to meet specific criteria: graduation from an accredited 4-year university demonstration of stable employment or career achievement, and a clean criminal record. Both children had to qualify before either could receive their share. My parents had realized that if I succeeded academically and professionally, they would have no control over my half of the inheritance, $7.5 million. But if I failed to meet the trust's requirements, my share would revert to Cordelia, giving her the full $15 million instead of just half. So they had systematically sabotaged my chances. The poisoning hadn't been random cruelty, it had been a calculated financial strategy. By destroying my cognitive abilities during my crucial developmental years, they had ensured I would struggle academically, fail to complete college, and never achieve the career success required by the trust. Meanwhile, they poured resources into Cordelia's education and career, guaranteeing she would easily meet all the requirements. I had to put these documents down and take a break because my hands were literally shaking. If you're feeling as shocked as I was in this moment, hit that like button because this story is about to get even crazier. And trust me, the revenge I got on them was so satisfying. Stick around because you won't believe how this ends. The private investigator had even discovered that my parents had been in communication with the trust's law firm, receiving regular updates on the requirements and my progress toward meeting them. They had been tracking my failures like a stock portfolio, celebrating each setback as a step closer to their financial goal. My grandmother's final notes, written just months before her death, revealed that she had been planning to expose everything. She had gathered enough evidence to not only prove what my parents had done to me, but also to pursue criminal charges for child abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. She had been working with lawyers to develop a strategy that would not only get me justice but also ensure I could still claim my rightful inheritance. But she had died before she could implement her plan. The last document in the box was a letter addressed to me dated just 2 weeks before my grandmother's death. My dearest Serafina, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you have found the truth at last. I am so sorry I couldn't protect you while this was happening. I suspected something was wrong, but by the time I had proof, the damage was already done. Please know that everything they told you about yourself was a lie. You are brilliant, capable, and deserving of every good thing in this world. Your parents stole 10 years of your life and your confidence, but they cannot steal your future unless you let them. The evidence in this box will give you back everything that was taken from you. Use it wisely, my dear girl. Make them pay for what they did, but more importantly, reclaim the life that was always meant to be yours. You are stronger than they ever allowed you to believe. I love you always, Grandmother Eleanor. I sat in that dusty attic for hours, crying and raging and trying to process the magnitude of what had been done to me. Every struggle I'd faced, every moment of self-doubt, every time I'd felt stupid or inadequate, it had all been manufactured. My parents hadn't just failed to support me. They had actively sabotaged me for money. But as the shock began to wear off, something else started building inside me. Something I had never felt before in my entire life, the burning, crystal-clear certainty that I deserved justice and the knowledge that I finally had the power to get it. The next few days were a blur of research, planning, and careful preparation. I had evidence of a crime that had been committed against me for over a decade, but I needed to be strategic about how I used it. My parents were wealthy, well-connected, and had spent 30 years building a reputation in their community. They wouldn't go down without a fight, and I needed to make sure my first strike was devastating enough to end the war before it began. My first step was to digitize everything. I scanned every document, photographed every page, and created multiple copies stored in different locations. I wasn't going to risk my grandmother's evidence disappearing the way I had almost disappeared. Then I started making phone calls. The law firm managing Great-Aunt Millicent's trust was my first contact. When I explained who I was and that I had new information regarding the inheritance requirements, they agreed to meet with me within the week. I didn't reveal the nature of my evidence over the phone. I wanted their full attention when I laid out the case. Next, I contacted the private investigator whose name was in my grandmother's files. Marcus Chen had retired from active investigation work, but when I explained the situation, he agreed to review the evidence and help me understand my legal options. His assessment was even more damning than I had hoped. This isn't just child abuse, Marcus told me during our meeting. This is conspiracy, fraud, theft by deception, and probably a dozen other charges. And the statute of limitations for most of these crimes doesn't start until the victim discovers the crime which just happened. You have criminal and civil remedies that could destroy them financially and put them in prison. But Marcus also warned me about the challenges ahead. Your parents will claim the evidence is fabricated, that your grandmother was confused or malicious, that you're making this up for money. You need to be prepared for them to fight dirty because people with this much to lose always do. That's when I decided my revenge needed to be more than just legal action. I needed to destroy their reputation the same way they had destroyed my life, systematically, thoroughly, and in a way that would ensure everyone knew exactly what kind of people they really were. I started with social media research, identifying everyone in my parents' social and professional circles. I made lists of my father's law firm colleagues, my mother's charity organization, contacts, their country club friends, neighbors, and extended family members. I researched local news outlets, particularly journalists who covered legal stories or family interest pieces. Then I began documenting everything about my current life that contradicted their narrative about my supposed limitations. I enrolled in online college courses and discovered that without the chemical fog that had clouded my childhood, I could learn rapidly and retain information with ease. I took aptitude tests and scored in the gifted range. I started a small online business that became profitable within weeks. The most satisfying part was realizing how much I had accomplished despite their sabotage. Even drugged and gaslit for a decade, I had still managed to build a life, hold down jobs, and maintain relationships. Imagine what I could have achieved if they hadn't poisoned me for 10 years. I also reached out to some of my old teachers, particularly Mrs. Rodriguez, who had taught my fourth grade class. When I contacted her, now retired, and gently probed about her memories of me as a student, her response confirmed what the records had shown. "Oh, Serafina, you were such a bright little girl," she said with genuine warmth. "I always wondered what happened to you. You started the year reading at a high school level and doing complex math problems for fun. But then something changed around October and you seemed to just fade. Your attention span shortened, your test scores dropped, and you became so lethargic. I asked your parents about it several times, but they said you were just settling into your natural ability level." Mrs. Rodriguez's testimony, along with similar accounts from other teachers, would provide crucial evidence that my decline hadn't been natural or gradual. It had been sudden and dramatic, coinciding exactly with when my parents had started their poisoning campaign. I spent weeks carefully crafting my strategy. The legal action would be the foundation, but I wanted the court of public opinion to render its verdict first. I prepared a detailed timeline with evidence, photos, and documentation. I wrote a clear, factual account of what had been done to me and why. I gathered character witnesses who could speak to both my current capabilities and my parents' pattern of undermining me. Most importantly, I planned the reveal for maximum impact. I wasn't going to confront my parents privately or give them a chance to prepare damage control. I was going to expose them in front of everyone who mattered to them in a setting where they couldn't escape or deflect, and in a way that would ensure the truth spread quickly through their entire social network. The perfect opportunity presented itself when my mother called to invite me to Cordelia's engagement party. Dr. Cordelia Walsh was marrying a successful surgeon, and my parents were throwing an elaborate celebration at their country club. All their friends, colleagues, and extended family would be there, the exact audience I needed for my revelation. "We hope you'll come, sweetheart," my mother said with that familiar tone of duty disguised as affection. "I know you sometimes feel left out of family celebrations, but this is important to Cordelia." I accepted the invitation with enthusiasm that surprised her. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Mom. In fact, I have something special planned for the evening. A family announcement of my own." I could hear the concern in her voice. "Oh, what kind of announcement? It's a surprise," I said cheerfully. "But don't worry, it's something that will change how everyone sees our family forever." That at least wasn't a lie. The country club was decorated like something out of a fairy tale, with white roses, crystal chandeliers, and elegantly dressed guests mingling with champagne glasses and congratulations for the happy couple. Cordelia looked radiant in a designer dress, accepting praise for her engagement to Dr. Marcus Westbrook, while our parents basked in the reflected glory of their successful daughter's continued achievements. I arrived fashionably late, wearing the most expensive dress I'd ever owned, a purchase I'd justified as an investment in my revenge. I had my grandmother's documents organized in a leather portfolio, along with copies for key guests, and a printed timeline that laid out 30 years of deception in clear, undeniable detail. My parents greeted me with their usual mixture of obligatory affection and poorly concealed disappointment. Serafina, dear, you look lovely, my mother said, though her eyes were already scanning for more important guests to schmooze. Try to mingle, won't you? And remember, tonight is about Cordelia. Don't worry, Mom, I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Tonight is definitely going to be memorable for Cordelia. And for you and Dad, too. I spent the first hour working the room strategically, having brief conversations with family, friends, my father's law partners, my mother's charity board colleagues, and extended family members. I was charming, confident, and deliberately mentioned that I had some exciting news to share later in the evening. The anticipation built naturally as people wondered what the family disappointment could possibly have to announce at her successful sister's engagement party. The moment I'd been waiting for came when my father stood to give his toast. The room quieted as Richard Walsh, respected attorney and pillar of the community, raised his glass to celebrate his daughter's engagement and bright future. Ladies and gentlemen, he began with his practiced courtroom confidence. Patricia and I couldn't be more proud of our daughter Cordelia tonight. She represents everything we hoped for in a child: intelligence, dedication, and the drive to make something meaningful of her life. The guests murmured appreciative agreement as Cordelia smiled graciously beside her fiancé. My father continued, as parents, we've always believed in investing our resources where they can do the most good. Cordelia has justified every ounce of faith and support we've given her, and we know she'll continue to make us proud as she builds her life with Marcus. More murmurs of approval. This was exactly the kind of self-congratulatory speech I'd expected, the perfect setup for what was coming next. In fact, my father said, warming to his theme, Cordelia's success makes us reflect on how different children can have such different trajectories. We've been blessed with one child who exemplifies excellence and another who, well, everyone's journey is different. A few uncomfortable glances were cast my way, but my father was just getting started. Patricia and I have always said that you have to be realistic about each child's potential. Some are destined for greatness, and others need different kinds of support and expectations. It's not anyone's fault, it's just how families work sometimes. The room was becoming noticeably uncomfortable now, but my father seemed oblivious to the growing tension. So tonight we celebrate not just Cordelia's engagement, but the validation of our parenting philosophy. When you invest wisely in the children who can provide returns on that investment, Dad, I interrupted, standing up with my portfolio in hand. Before you finish that thought, I have something I'd like to share with everyone. The room went completely silent. My father looked annoyed at being interrupted, but curious about what I might have to say. My mother looked nervous. She'd always had better instincts than my father about when danger was approaching. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Cordelia. I began, my voice steady and clear. And thank you, Dad, for that fascinating insight into your parenting philosophy. Because what you've just described, investing in children based on their potential and being realistic about their limitations, is exactly what I want to talk about tonight. I opened my portfolio and pulled out the first document. 30 years ago, my great-aunt Millicent left a trust fund of $15 million to be split equally between Cordelia and me, contingent on both of us meeting certain educational and professional requirements by age 30. What most people in this room don't know is that my parents decided they wanted Cordelia to get the entire inheritance instead of just half. A murmur went through the crowd. My parents' faces had gone pale. To ensure that I would fail to meet the trust requirements and that my half of the inheritance would revert to Cordelia, my parents spent 10 years systematically poisoning me with prescription drugs designed to impair my cognitive function. The murmur became gasps. Several people set down their champagne glasses. From ages 6 to 16, they crushed anti-anxiety medications and mild antipsychotics into my food and drinks, creating artificial learning disabilities that made me appear intellectually inferior to my sister. The medical records documenting this abuse were hidden by my grandmother, who had hired private investigators to prove what was being done to me. I held up the toxicology reports so everyone could see them. Every struggle I had in school, every moment I felt stupid or inadequate, every time I disappointed you all with my apparent limitations, all of it was manufactured by my parents for financial gain. The room erupted. People were standing, talking over each other, staring at my parents in shock and horror. My mother had tears streaming down her face, and my father looked like he was preparing to either flee or attack me. But I wasn't finished. The reason I'm sharing this tonight at Cordelia's engagement party is because I want everyone here, all of Dad's law partners, all of Mom's charity friends, all our family and friends, to understand exactly what kind of people you've been socializing with for the past 30 years. I pulled out copies of the documents and began handing them to the guests closest to me. These are copies of the medical evidence, the private investigators' reports, and the documentation of my parents' conspiracy to commit child abuse and inheritance fraud. I've also included the contact information for the journalists who will be covering this story in tomorrow's newspaper. The chaos in the room was escalating. Cordelia was crying, her fiancé looked stunned, and several of my father's law partners were already examining the documents with the focused attention of attorneys who recognized potential criminal liability when they saw it. Serafina, my father said, his voice shaking with rage, "This is ridiculous. You're having some kind of breakdown. Actually, Dad, for the first time in my life, I'm thinking completely clearly," I interrupted. Which is what happens when you're not being systematically poisoned by your own parents. I turned back to the crowd, many of whom were now photographing the documents with their phones. "I'll be filing criminal charges on Monday morning. The FBI has already opened an investigation into the inheritance fraud. And I'll be pursuing civil litigation for the 10 years of my life that were stolen from me." I smiled at my parents one final time. "Oh, and Mom, Dad, you might want to call your lawyers. Because unlike the scared, confused little girl you created, I'm actually quite intelligent when I'm not being drugged. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you are." The aftermath of that evening was everything I had hoped for, and more. Within 24 hours, the story had spread throughout my parents' entire social and professional network. Videos of the confrontation recorded by shocked party guests went viral on social media. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled "Prominent Attorney Accused of Poisoning Daughter for Inheritance Money." My father's law firm placed him on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. But the real satisfaction came from watching their carefully constructed world crumble piece by piece, exactly the way they had methodically destroyed my confidence and potential for 10 years. The criminal investigation moved swiftly. The medical evidence was undeniable, and the private investigators' documentation provided a clear timeline and motive. Within 3 weeks, both my parents were arrested on charges of child abuse, conspiracy fraud, and inheritance tampering. The sight of my father, who had spent his career putting other people in handcuffs, being led away from his office in shackles, was captured by news photographers and appeared on the front page of every local publication. My mother's charity organizations immediately distanced themselves from her, releasing statements about their commitment to child welfare and their shock at the allegations. The country club revoked their membership. Their neighbors, who had once admired them as pillars of the community, now whispered about them as monsters who had poisoned their own child for money. Cordelia's response was perhaps the most satisfying part of all. Initially, she tried to defend our parents, claiming the evidence must be fabricated and that I was having a mental health crisis brought on by jealousy. But as more details emerged and she was forced to confront the reality of what they had done, something shifted in her understanding of our family dynamic. She came to see me 3 months after the arrest, her engagement ring noticeably absent from her finger. Marcus called off the wedding, she said quietly, sitting in my living room, the same small apartment she had once looked down on with pity. His family didn't want to be associated with the scandal. His career could be damaged by connection to this. For the first time in our lives, I felt genuinely sorry for my sister. She had lost her fiancé, her perfect reputation, and her understanding of the family that had always celebrated her success. Sarah, she said, using my childhood nickname for the first time in years, I need you to know that I didn't know. I swear to you, I had no idea what they were doing. I thought you just I thought you were different from me naturally. Looking at her, I realized that in some ways she had been as much a victim of our parents' manipulation as I had been. They had used her success as a weapon against me and used my failures as a way to make her feel superior. She had been raised to believe that love was conditional on achievement and that her worth was dependent on being better than me. I believe you, I told her, but I also need you to understand that I'm not going to protect them. They poisoned me for 10 years, Cordelia. They stole my childhood, my education, and my self-worth for money. They were willing to destroy my entire life so you could get a bigger inheritance. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, and I've been thinking, what if I had been the one they decided was expendable? What if you had been older, or if the trust had been structured differently, they would have done this to me instead? That conversation marked the beginning of a new relationship between my sister and me, one based on truth instead of manufactured competition. She testified for the prosecution during the criminal trial and publicly supported my civil lawsuit against our parents. The legal proceedings took 18 months, but the outcomes exceeded my wildest dreams for justice. My father was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud charges, plus additional time for the child abuse convictions. My mother received 8 years. They were also ordered to pay restitution covering not just my stolen inheritance share, but damages for the education, career opportunities, and quality of life they had taken from me. The trust fund situation was resolved even more satisfactorily. The court ruled that since I had been prevented from meeting the trust requirements through criminal interference, the requirements were waived for my portion of the inheritance. I received my full $7.5 million plus interest and penalties that brought the total to nearly $10 million. But more importantly, I received something I had never had in my entire life: validation, that I was intelligent, capable, and deserving of respect. At 33, I went back to college and discovered that I could easily handle advanced coursework. I started a business that became successful within its first year. I traveled, pursued hobbies I had never thought I was smart enough to enjoy, and built relationships with people who valued me for who I actually was. The most poetic justice came when I used my inheritance to establish a foundation for children who had been abused or neglected by their families. The Serafina Walsh Foundation provides educational support, therapy, and legal assistance to kids whose own parents had failed to protect or nurture them. My first major grant went to fund research into the long-term effects of systematic psychological abuse on child development. My parents filed appeals claiming they were innocent victims of a vindictive daughter and a confused elderly woman. But the evidence was overwhelming, and their appeals were denied. My father's law license was permanently revoked. My mother lost her position on several charity boards and faced social ostracism wherever she went. The final piece of karma came when they lost their house, their savings, and their retirement funds paying for legal fees and restitution. The people who had been willing to destroy their daughter's life for money ended up broke, imprisoned, and publicly disgraced. As I'm recording this story, it's been 2 years since that engagement party confrontation. My parents are still in prison. Cordelia and I have a relationship that's slowly healing, built on honesty instead of competition. I've graduated from college with honors, my business is thriving, and I wake up every day grateful for the clarity of mind I never knew I was missing. The most beautiful irony is that by trying to steal my potential, my parents actually revealed it. Fighting for justice taught me that I was far stronger and more capable than they had ever allowed me to believe. The little girl they had drugged into submission grew up to be the woman who brought them to justice. So here's my question for all of you watching this. Have you ever experienced family betrayal that made you question everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you? How did you handle discovering that the people who were supposed to protect you were actually working against you? Share your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences help other people feel less alone in their struggles. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that it's never too late to discover your true worth, even when the people who should have supported you tried to tear you down instead. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community where we can talk honestly about family trauma and recovery. Remember, you are stronger than the people who tried to diminish you, and you deserve all the success and happiness that was meant to be yours from the beginning. Until next time, keep fighting for your truth and never let anyone convince you that you're less than you really are. Justice might be slow, but when it comes, it's incredibly sweet.